today is how to solicit major gifts in your capital campaign. This is a often requested topic of teaching from Dennis and our consultants here at Church Development, as it can be pretty intimidating to ask somebody in your community for a leadership gift, probably the largest donation they've ever given in their lives. And so some sensitivity there, definitely. You don't want to be offensive to people who are in your community. You want to be aware of giving as a spiritual practice. And so that's what we're going to talk to you about today, how to ask for a major gift in your capital campaign in a way that doesn't offend your friends, and also invites people to be a part of the mission of the church. So looks like we have just about everybody on here, and we'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome Dennis Green, President and Founder of Church Development. Welcome, Dennis. He's going to share with you experiences that he's had over the past almost 30 years working in stewardship ministry and organizational development, based on research that he's done and we've done as an organization. And we hope that you find what we have to share today helpful for you and your church and your ministry. So take it away, Dennis.
Thank you very much, Meredith. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for joining us. So I know this might make you think that I'm a weirdo, but I've been studying this subject since 1982. I've read many books, taken many classes, and I've practiced a lot. I figure I've helped raise more than $1 billion for charitable organizations. And 100% of the time it involves asking major donors for their financial support. As you can imagine, I've made my share of mistakes, and I try to follow Chuck Norris's advice regarding success, which is, number one, figure out what doesn't work, and number two, don't do that. So by process of elimination, I figured out just basically 3 techniques which will guarantee your success in soliciting major gifts for your capital campaign. Now, most of my experience for the past almost 30 years has been with church capital campaigns, but I've worked with every kind of nonprofit organization, from museums to colleges to Red Cross to YMCA, you name it, I have worked there. And it has been an absolute pleasure. It's how I met my wife. I've made many friends, and it's been very fulfilling and nurturing work. Now, I want to deal with one issue right up front. It is not us versus them. It is not attack mode. I made the fallacious assumption one time that pursuing major gifts was like alligator wrestling. It's a bad assumption. But to better understand that assumption, I took an alligator wrestling class. So this is a picture of me entering the swamp, looking for the alligator, grabbing the alligator by the tail and dragging it out, and then wrestling it to the ground. Now that might make you think that's a bit extreme. Yes, it is, but it would help me better understand the relationship of my prefrontal cortex to my amygdala, part of the science of understanding how our brains work. So it's not us versus them. There are 3 very important principles, and I put together this agenda to cover them. Now, the cool thing about these webinars is you can ask questions. You can interrupt. I've got Meredith and Stephanie, who are my co-presenters, who will help identify questions as we go. But I put together these 6 points to cover our subjects. And furthermore, I've got a book I'll give you. Let me just grab a copy. This is the stewardship system. I wrote this after 20 years experience in doing this, and I'll give it to you. If you send me a note or call me, I'll give it to you for free. How to increase generosity without fundraising, and it's full of our research. And one of the first things we'll cover is this 80-20 rule, and it's called the Pareto principle. It is across all industries and exists in fundraising as well. 80% of the funds will come from 20% of the donors, and if it doesn't fit this, which means it's even worse, it might be 90% of the funds come from 10% of the donors. When Stanford did their first $1 billion campaign, 95% of the funds came from 5% of their donors. It's interesting, isn't it? So number two is, who are they? Who are the people who will be your lead donors? Well, so we'll study the past and also researching potential future leadership donors. Number three are these key processes that will really help you if you engage them. A and B are like multiplier factors. The better you do with 3A, engaging donors as decision makers, and 3B, engaging donors as volunteers, the more generous they will be. Now, 3C is like a binary switch. If you don't connect them socially, if they think they're the only ones making a major gift, that's an on-off switch that will be switched off. You got to be very prudent in planning your process. Item 4, we're going to cover the calendar. How long does it take? I'm informed by, I read a lot, and I just read a study of major gift officers' best practices for colleges and universities. And my personal experience fits well with their industry-wide survey. And the bad news is you really need to have a year-long calendar in it. So the good news is you know what you're facing, so begin today. Number 5, we'll talk about the ask, and I've included some key phrases. You don't have to be direct. You don't have to be high pressure. You just need to ask very gentle questions. Would you consider? Would you join me? Since we're churches, we can say, would you pray your way through a decision? So it doesn't have to be high pressure like alligator wrestling. It can be very gentle, as if you are facilitating their decision making. Number 6 on our agenda might be the biggest and most important thing. We'll talk about thanking and follow through. The research from behavioral economics has instructed us, a year after your capital campaign commitment Sunday, please ask everyone for a gift in their estate. It works. If they've invested in the capital campaign, many of them will also invest in a planned gift to ensure their original investment was a good one. Isn't that interesting? So you can have these slides and you can share them with others. They'll be available just 24 hours after this webinar concludes. We have a wide variety of webinars. We try to give away everything that we know. We hope, of course, that when you want to do a capital campaign, you give us a call and allow us to submit a bid. But we want to share everything that we have learned. Now, when we do a capital campaign, we stick around for 3 years with our clients to ensure that their annual giving goes up by 10% per year. And we help them begin a planned giving effort. And we usually raise as much in our planned giving effort as we do in our capital campaign. Isn't that interesting? And you can email me to get these slides and call me. Here's my phone number. You can call me if you're planning a capital campaign or if you'd like some help with visiting major donors. I do that. I'm doing that right now, even though we're isolated by COVID. I spend a lot of time working for my clients, contacting major donors, and it is a pleasure. We all share the same values and we all embrace the same vision. Somebody just has got to do that human contact, because it should not be a random, isolated, impersonal activities. It should be very human. Now, we were founded in 1992, so we've been at this for a really long time. We've raised more than $200 million in capital campaigns and a lot more than that in annual campaigns. So we're up somewhere around the $1 billion mark. And we're a little different because we're based in Scripture and we have 30 years of research and experience behind us. So we try to conduct ourselves in a rational manner based on our spiritual beliefs. The ask is based in prayer and not pressure, which results in annual giving goes up, and we make sure it goes up for the 3 years after the capital campaign. And the planned giving program has enormous long-term benefits. You can see more at our website if you'd like to go there. So this differentness is something that I really enjoy, and what usually happens is if someone hires us for a capital campaign, they hire us for the next one 5 years later and the next one 5 years after that. So I have some clients I've been working with for decades. It's a real pleasure. Our work is based on 1 Peter 4:10. I like it because it recognizes everything that we have comes from God, and it's up to us to figure out how we can be a conduit for God's blessings. We're also rooted in sound scientific research. This is my favorite researcher, Daniel Kahneman, who wrote the book Thinking Fast and Slow. He won a Nobel Prize. So we borrow a lot from the science sector and the corporate marketing sector as well, which basically means we raise a ton of money. We raise more money than anybody else, and it is a pleasant experience. Peter Drucker was one of my favorite marketing theorists. He said, good marketing makes selling superfluous. My version of that same topic is good stewardship makes fundraising superfluous. So if we do a good job of engaging, generosity naturally flows. So there's a picture of me and a little bit about me. I've got 4 kids, had a couple of near-death experiences. I'm a cancer survivor. Married to a wonderful woman who's also a church nerd. Had my research published in the International Journal of Innovation and Education. Now, these 7 factors, why do people give generously to their church? This is kind of the foundation of the stewardship system, which we give away for free. You can go to Church Development and subscribe to this, and you get monthly bulletin inserts and a year-round calendar and set of activities. It doesn't cost anything, but the number one reason people give generously is they embrace 1 Peter 4:10. They get the idea that everything that we have comes from God. The ask is based in prayer and discernment. They've been involved in the decision-making process, so it's not an us versus them that somebody is selling to them. They've had that social connection, interacting with their peers, and they've been involved as a volunteer. What we've discovered is that people who are involved as volunteers give 11 times more than those who are not involved as volunteers. So we want to find a way to get our top donors involved as volunteers, even if it's the easiest possible thing. They need to be asked. There needs to be a deadline. It's not a rolling, but it is a deadline that we set up long in advance. So the subconscious only knows 2 times, either now or not now. So we want to set up the now to begin that decision-making process. It's very important that we thank them. We do a very good job. Doesn't cost hardly any money, but a lot of people say, I've given for years to my church, and I have never been thanked before. That's a common problem that we have. So these 7 you can get automatically delivered to you. Now, the first concept that I want to talk about, that a lot of people have a hard time embracing, and this exists for you, so I would like you to tomorrow get your bookkeeping person to create this list for you, okay? Give me a list of our top 100 donors. Maybe you just start with the top 100 and lump everybody else below that into that bottom category. And list by amount for the last fiscal year. You will discover that your giving profile looks amazingly like this, where you have one donor that gives 10 to 20% of all the funds that come in. You've got about 10 total donors who give you about half of all the funds that come in. And in your top 100, you're going to have the bulk, somewhere between 60 to 90% just from your top 100. And you'll have many donors at that lower level. And, thank the Lord for those many donors, because we're all joining together, and money is a form of energy. It is a blessing that flows through us. But pragmatically speaking, you need to figure out who your 80-20 is right now. And this is going to be part of your life job assignment to be a success in leading your organization for the rest of your life. It's really embarrassing, but I've been part of more than 200 capital campaigns. And 100% of the time, I have the pastor or the lead minister or the executive say the words, well, I didn't know that person was part of our top giving strata. 100% of the time. So I'd like you to change that. Okay? People are not offended. As a matter of fact, yesterday I talked to a donor in New York City, and she asked me lots and lots of questions. And then her conclusion, I thought she was going to be mad at me. But she said, it's about time someone called and said, thank you, and asked for my opinion. So I was a little bit shocked, but I mean, I felt very good that she recognized that I am here really as a servant to those donors, as a servant to the organization, to facilitate the fulfillment of the vision. And that's based in the values of the organization. So we should act like grown-ups here and act like real professionals. And this is how the system works. So I'd like you to begin right now. A lot of people are afraid of it, but boy, once you get into it, it is an absolute pleasure. And people will treat you the way that woman treated me from New York. She's very grateful. It's about time someone treated me nicely. Interesting insight. So for you, the first step is really to identify your current major donor. So get some help pulling your list of your past giving records and list them by amount. And don't do it just for, maybe your first cut is just the first year, but really look at your past 2 or 3 years, because with that upper 1% of our economic strata of this country, which is identified as people who have $360,000 per year of income or more, that's our top 1%. A lot of their income is derived from their assets, and even though the Dow has been on a steady climb, it's now down, but it has been on a steady climb, and people might invest in a variety of things outside the stock market. Their investments might ebb and flow, so they might have given a lot 3 years ago, and the last 2 years an investment might have gone south, and there's a dip, but they're still among your potential leadership donors because of their history. This is the standard practice in all fundraising, okay, is to go looking historically at who have been our leadership donors. Now, the leading edge of professionalism is to analyze and research who might be our potential major donors. Now, there are a series of firms out there. You can Google the subject, donor research firms. Another term is wealth analysis. And this is all based on publicly available information. For instance, my coworker, Daryl, who's the most awesome capital campaign consultant in the world, had a church he worked with that did their donor research and found that they had a donor that was giving more than $100,000 per year to the local university that had a wonderful basketball program, and they would give the donors front row seats, which is cool, but they were only given $1,000 a year to the church. So Daryl, being astute, identified a potential there, presented that information to the pastor and said, well, could we invite them over for dinner and ask their opinion? The pastor said, that's a great idea. And so they did, and it worked immediately. It was a very low-pressure dinner in which the pastor presented, here's what I'm thinking, and then asked their opinion. What do you think? It was about that sophisticated an agenda. Here's what's going on. What do you think? And, of course, it happened during a delicious meal where there's a lot of rapport building and sharing, personal disclosure, and getting to know you activities. But the next day, they brought by a check for $100,000 in gratitude. I remember the donor quote was, well, we need to get caught up. There's so many good things happening here. It took no asking. Matter of fact, they weren't asked. It was just a getting to know you activity based on item 2A, okay? Who are our potential leadership donors, and then let's engage them. If you don't want to do that, you can ask. You can put together a confidential team and say, who among our parish should be among our lead donors? Then make a list, and it's between you and your finance folks of who are our top 10, who are our top 100. And then you've got to get busy. And it's work, but it is very pleasant work. It's surprisingly pleasant. It's a delight. So we got to begin with our top 10, and I really like the pyramid shape because there are very few donors at the top, and those top 10 can make or break your campaign. So if in the year ahead you only do one thing, create a top 10 lead donor tailored plan, okay? Top 10. Maybe you can get it all on one little pad of paper, put it in your drawer, name and plan. And here are the 3 critical, essential, vital activities which will stimulate their generosity. Number 1, involve them in a decision. Number 2, engage them as a volunteer. And number 3, connect them socially. Now, I say create a tailored plan because each of those 10 families will have different needs. Some might be on the parish council now. You don't have to do anything to involve them in decision making. But I bet some of them used to be on the parish council and they don't know what's going on. So, time to invite them and get their input on a decision. Number 2, engage them as a volunteer. So you're going to ask them to give their time, their expertise, their wisdom, and maybe it's as simple as serving on an advisory committee or sharing a quote with you. But that act of volunteering is a conversion experience. And then number 3, connecting socially. We are going to find a way to facilitate them getting engaged with people who share their values and who have similar lives. Now remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the concept of unmet needs motivate? Well, it turns out George Barna, a church shopping expert, Barna, B-A-R-N-A, wrote extensively about church shopping. And he has discovered that the driving factor in church selection is a social one. Isn't that interesting? It is no longer dogma, rather. It is social connections. I need to find people who are like me. Isn't that fascinating? So the number 1 step, let's dig in with some detail, and I welcome you can interrupt with a question or a concern. Just click on your chat box at the bottom of the screen. You can type in under the Q&A box, or you can type in under the chat, and my co-workers, Stephanie and Meredith, can help me deal with those questions as we go. But fire away. So number 1, involve them in decision making. It is the easiest thing in the world for the pastor to pick up the phone, call the number 1 person on your research list and say, hey, are you free for coffee? I'd like your opinion. It takes 1 minute to make the call. It takes an hour to have lunch or coffee. And in that, you ask their opinion. You share, here's the challenge we're experiencing. What's your opinion? How should we proceed? You share the challenge. You begin with the why, okay? And you might even get their help identifying the why. We have this problem, and I'm kind of looking for underlying causes. And to access another individual's creativity is really a compliment. It really says, I value you as a person. So what's going on here? So by involving them in decision-making, we're increasing the social connection between them and the pastor. And by asking their opinion, we're really asking them to become a volunteer. Lend your brilliance to the church. Lend your brilliance to our problem solving. Become engaged on behalf of the organization. Now, down the road, we in every circumstance recommend a feasibility study before you do a capital campaign, and that is a very formalized, very honorable way of collecting input from your top 10, from your top 100, from everybody in the entire congregation. So a church capital campaign will always be preceded by a feasibility study, which has lots of interviews asking people for input. So number 2, we're going to engage people as volunteers. The most common method
Dennis.
is... Yes.
Well, I'm interrupting you with a question from the chat. A comment about sometimes pastors can shy away from involving people in decision making, fearing that people who have a lot of financial resources might use their resources to drive their own personal agendas with what might be going on in the church. So can you just speak to that fear and
Yes.
address what you've seen and how you've seen pastors handle that?
Yes, that's a great question. Let me give you 3 different answers to that. And this just comes from my experience over the past 30 years. Twice I have seen checks returned. So out of thousands and thousands of donations, very few have gotten to that. So yeah, you ought to be concerned about it. And once in a while, somebody does want to do that. Like I remember one donor wanted to redesign the church. So wrote a check to the church, handed it to the pastor, and then gave the pastor instructions. I want that moved over there. And the pastor didn't know how to respond, just took the check and put it in their pocket and say, well, okay, that's not really my decision, and there are some formalities, but let me think this through, okay? And then the pastor consulted the parish finance council, who gave a resounding no. And so the pastor put it back in an envelope with a letter that said, well, we can't do that. So that's example number one. Next example was, as I was about to begin, a feasibility study. I had a pastor say to me, well, Dennis, what if the answer comes out no? What if the people do not want to support this project financially? And my answer to the pastor was, well, then we're not going to do it. If the people say in this feasibility study, no, we're not going to give money to this project, then by golly, we're going to exercise our God-given common sense and not do this. And so after a moment, he thought about it. He thought, oh, well, I guess that makes sense. You know, and I would sure like to discover that in advance rather than after the fact. Now, the third one comes from just a couple months ago. It was the last campaign we finished right before COVID descended and messed everything up. And that was going to be, we had a really successful church capital campaign. We raised 300% of annual giving in 3-year pledges for the capital campaign. Annual giving went up by 20%. It was on the same pledge card. We had 3 things on the same pledge card. And then the third part was giving to a diocesan annual campaign, a denomination-wide campaign. And their giving there was up significantly as well. So we had all 3 things on one pledge card, and it was home run, major increase, and minor increase. Okay? It was mega. It was super. It was fantastic. Now, one of our standard procedures is after a capital campaign, we have identified our top donors. And then the next thing that we do is we create a very tailored list. And we're going to go back to those top donors in the next year, and we're going to ask them, would you like to make an additional gift, which you could sponsor the cost of one of these 7 things? You could underwrite the cost of the new altar, the new ambo, the new entrance, the new baptismal font. It's not random. It's carefully selected. And no, they don't get to put their name on the ambo or the baptismal font or the altar. This is not Dennis Green's baptismal font. No, they could sponsor with an additional gift. So it is not random. It is very deliberate. So we want to be kind of wary and aware that some people might want to do that, but it's just very, very, very rare that someone does actually attempt to do that. That's a great question. Thank you for asking. I'm open to any other questions. Fire away, because you just think, you know, I'm old and crusty at this point. I have seen just about everything flow under the bridge of fundraising, and at this point, nothing blows my mind. Okay, so let's go back to engaging people as volunteers. The standard procedure is to ask your top 10 leadership prospects to serve on an advisory team. And beyond that, we could make it a big advisory team. You could have half of your top 100. That's what a college board of directors is like. They might have 50 people on an advisory board. They only meet once a month for about an hour and a half. They have a meal, and they get a policy level update. Another thing they could do, your top 10 or top 100 prospects could host a meeting. They could have something at their house or convene their friends. It'd be easy. Number 3, get a quote from them on video. They're extending themselves as a volunteer. They're becoming a spokesperson. You could ask for their input on creating a plan. If they turn down everything, my fallback is for the pastor to say, well, may I call you on a monthly basis to get your input? Could you be my personal advisor? And everybody says yes to that. Nobody complains about that. So the idea of engaging them as a volunteer is a conversion experience. It's no longer us versus them. Now, I'd like to quote right out of the book by Charles Zeck, a researcher at Villanova, who wrote the book Why Catholics Don't Give, and he wrote a corresponding volume, Best Practices in Parish Stewardship. And the phenomenon he discovered that is when there is an assertive welcoming committee which basically means everybody in the church is on the welcoming committee, and you see somebody that you don't know, you assert yourself on behalf of the church to welcome the new person. When that happens, giving goes up by 9%. So we know the moment I assert myself on behalf of the church, I have a sense of ownership. I become a stakeholder in the church. That's what we want to have. No longer us versus them, but I am part of the effort. This is critical. And remember the statistic I shared earlier. An active donor will give 11 times more than a non-donor. Isn't that fascinating? So this should be the key focus of your fundraising activities. All right, number 3, connecting lead donors socially. Now this pie chart that you're looking at right here comes from Gallup polling ME25, analysis of church engagement. It's kind of bad news. In the old days, we thought it was a third, a third, and a third. Well, it's not. The highly involved are now only 15%. Those who are kind of waiting to be engaged, kind of the mid-level of the target, that's about 50%. They need to be invited to be more engaged. And on the way out, the marginally involved is about 35%. Now, another interesting thing that Gallup polling discovered is there's a 1% slice that cuts across all 3 of these groups, and that is the complainers. The Gallup polling academicians titled them CAVE, which stands for consistently against virtually everything. I know that's hilarious, but when people complain to you, which I'm sure they do, they complain in my church, I'm sure they'll complain in yours, just 1% are only comfortable when they're identifying something that is wrong. So just be aware of that, okay? Now, to make this news even worse, there's a prominent Catholic writer named Matthew Kelly, who is not a scientist, but he's done a lot of work in the church, and he has conjectured that the inner circle that I've identified here as 15% is really only 6%, which is a huge bummer. So that's really a bummer. Now, I talked to you a moment ago about George Barna and church shopping and the social impetus for people selecting a church. It is true, it's the unmet need that motivates. So what can we do to connect people socially? Top 10 donors, one-on-one with the pastor. Top 100, small groups with the pastor. Do not ask your pastor to manage these activities. Have a paid professional manage the cultivation activities, which means identifying who, setting up activities, giving the pastor a script before each event. Here's what you need to say. Here are the questions you need to ask. So the pastor does not get burnt out. They just need to show up, and he or she needs to be just their lovable self. It does not need to be a painful experience. So when we want someone to connect with others socially, maybe they're comfortable being a spokesperson. Maybe we could get them on film. Maybe they could be making announcements. Maybe they could make themselves available to answer questions. We could inform them. They could be one of our spokespeople that allow us to interact with people socially. You know, in the church world, breaking bread, that's where we put this picture here. Breaking bread is the best possible way to connect people socially. So a church capital campaign frequently looks like a series of parties, really fun parties. Our best reference out of our 200 churches, their quote was, "We need to do this again next year whether we need the money or not." That's hilarious. Who would ever say that about fundraising? But the connecting socially is a joyful experience. So that is kind of a font of generosity. Now, a standard procedure is to get people to serve on a team. So that would allow somebody to make new friends, to reinvigorate old friends, to become more connected in the tapestry of the life of the church. Now, it's just very important. So plan ways. Start thinking now how we can connect people socially. So the capital campaign calendar is kind of bad news. And it really means you got to start today. Even if you're a year away from your capital campaign and the soliciting of your major donors. So right now, this minute, identify your top 10 and your top 100, and then move on into who should be in our top 100. It's going to take a little bit of work. Then begin your donor engagement activities today, as soon as possible, a year before capital campaign commitment Sunday. Now, we we start this a long time in advance, and we think that's just a common sense good idea, but this key insight came from that survey of 1,000 college and university major gifts officers, and how do they implement the best practices for cultivating major gifts. And they gave that 1-year time frame. Now, in my opinion, the best job in the entire world for an extrovert is to be a major gifts officer, because literally what you do is you're on the phone and you're sending text and emails and you're visiting and taking people out to lunch and you're sharing information about an institution that's very important to you and you're asking their opinion. So you have this values-based friendship, and it's a delight. If you do it right, then truly giving is superfluous, because you have a relationship and you're just asking them, well, would you like to get involved? It's completely up to you, but pray your way through it. So step number 1 is do your research, get your act together, and then be very deliberate in launching your cultivation activities. We think that you should start stewardship education this minute and just plan on doing it on a weekly or monthly basis for eternity. Most people don't get the idea. Matter of fact, I can quantify that. 95% of us don't get the idea. Only 5% of us actually tithe. Isn't that interesting? The average person just gives 1 to 2% of their income to their church. Most of us have a lot of room to grow. So stewardship education is your best bet, and believe it or not, your best way of educating people about stewardship is through stories. It's not rational, it's not pressure, it's story. We think the best educators are lay volunteers, just telling their story about how God's blessings flow through them. It's very compelling. We have a 20-year longitudinal study of a group of 100 churches, and we discovered just doing stewardship education over time doubles giving on a per capita basis. So we know that it works. Okay, this third part of the calendar, the time to begin, one of the activities at the front of beginning your campaign is to thank people for their previous giving. Now, I'm looking on my desk for an annual report, and I didn't bring it to her, but an annual report is proof that your previous gifts were well spent. Even if it's just a 1-page annual report, it just shows, it says thank you, and it shows here's what happened with the money that you've given. So we want to thank everybody in that annual report for giving and for volunteering. And that sets the foundation for the next ask. We want to have sermons and announcements, and matter of fact, a gigantic flow outward of information that really communicates, first of all, the why and then the what. But we really have to begin with the why are we doing these activities? What's our bottom line? What's our human impact? Now, there has to be personal contact before anybody will make a gift, particularly among your leadership donors. And that personal contact really needs to be with the pastor. Now, the pastor shouldn't set it up, as I mentioned a moment ago. Please don't burn out your pastor. Get a paid person, either staff or a consultant. This is a big part of what we do. When you hire church development to manage your capital campaign, we just become staff of the church for about half a year, and we handle the myriad details so that people do not get burnt out. Inevitably, if you hire a professional to help you, you're going to raise more money. We keep track of that, as a matter of fact. When somebody does a capital campaign on their own, they don't cover all the bases, so they usually raise 50% of annual giving in 3-year pledges. Our average over the past 3 years is to raise 250% of annual giving in 3-year pledges. And the reason why lays in these details. Someone has got to be fiercely attentive to details, from the researching of the who to the cultivation activities through the asking process. So it really is a lot like farming. It takes somebody who's willing to dive in and invest their life wholly. And we've got a team of 6 people who cover all the bases. And that's why we raise more money than anybody else. It's purely work. It's purely farming. Now, there has to be a commitment Sunday, which sets a date for giving so that I know when. So I got to begin with the why and I end with the when. And then beyond that, you have to do the follow-up. Now, the follow-up is real important because you want them to give again, and we want them to remember us in their estate plan. But let's talk for a minute about the ask, okay? And I'm open, as I said earlier, I'm open to any questions or concerns that you might have. The chat box and the Q&A section of your frame down below is available for anything that you would like to ask. Remember, I've made every mistake in the book, so feel free to fire away. So the top 10 really must be done by the pastor, and it's got to be literally a phone call to say, may I come by on Tuesday afternoon to hand deliver your packet? And universally they say, oh no, Pastor, you don't have to do that. You can just put it in the mail like everybody else. And you got to say, on Tuesday afternoon, I'm out delivering packets and you're on my list. May I stop by? If they say no, we'll be out of town. So, well, when are you going to be in town? Your packet's on my desk. I need to hand deliver it. Now, when the pastor goes, you hand deliver it. You say, here is your packet. You'll see inside of there a letter that from me to you, asking you to join us in this capital campaign. But before I ask you to make such a pledge, which you don't have to do today, the main thing I want you to do is pray your way through a decision. So the ask is, will you pray your way through a decision? That's the ask. Most people think, well, I have to ask for $1 million. Well, the research that I mentioned earlier from Zach at Villanova is really the best ask is the percentage ask. So we publicize the percentage ask all during the campaign, and it's a different percent for different churches and their economic circumstances, but the standard is going to be a 3% ask. And that is based in the macroeconomic perspective that the average person gives 1% to 2% of their income, and Gallup polling did a poll to discover the ceiling on comfort level for giving for most people being 5%. So we've just very narrowly, scientifically discovered the sweet spot. Now, for you personally, if you're a Catholic church and people give 3% of their income, what that means is that your campaign, you would raise 9 times annual giving. If people gave 3% of their income in a Protestant church, that means that they would raise 6 times annual giving. So the potential amount of money that you can raise based on a percentage ask is enormous. And there's just a ton of psychological research. So the ask is repeated in the letter, it's in the publications, it's even in the prayer and discernment book. Here's a wonderful prayer guide that comes from the Minister of the Arts for this church, which I can't see the name of, but it's a prayer guide, 2-week prayer guide. You pray your way through that. And people universally say, well, yes, I will pray my way through this. Very gentle, and it works. The top 100, we want a leader handing them their packet. We want the pastor to deliver as many as they can, but if they can only deliver 1 or 3 or 5 or 10 or 40, we still got to get some other volunteers. And so we want a human being who's a friend of theirs to hand them the packet. So I can call my buddies, you can call your buddies, you can say, hey, I'm on this team and I got your packet. Can I come by on Sunday? And they'll say, oh, no, just put it in the mail. Say, well, we're not allowed to. I have to hand deliver. You can be around? Yes. So friend to friend by somebody who's on the committee. That's the best possible way to do this. It's a percentage income ask. We want to give them an approximation of what impact your gift could have. So, for instance, if you're building a new church, it might cost $360 per square foot or $10 per month for the next 36 months. Oh, that's a rough approximation. Now, our guidelines, it needs to have a visual, auditory, and kinesthetic quality to it. So I'm going to describe it in a way they can see and hear and feel. So I could sponsor 1 square foot, or I could sponsor a pew or a door or a window or the roof or the foundation. These are approximations of the impact of my gift. I'm not selling them. You don't get to put your name on a door or a window or a pew, but now I know the impact of my gift. That having that chart in the brochure is extremely important. Then the conclusion is, will you pray your way through this and discern what God would do through you for the campaign and bring it to church by the 15th by Commitment Sunday. And people universally say, well, yes, I'll do that. So the ask, though it might seem like alligator wrestling, is very gentle, and it's sweet, and it is based in prayer, and it is a relationship building experience, which is what it ought to be. It is not us versus them. It is us together. And together we're discerning God's will in our life. And that's a very, really pleasant way to run a campaign. I love it. That's why I get hired over and over again, and why I've made so many friends. It's because it can be pleasant. And regularly we're hired to follow up after a disaster. Just happened to be recently, in which the asking process was so offensive, and the packets had a dollar amount, and the visitors went to go visit a donor prospect, handed them the letter. It had a dollar amount on the pledge card, and then the visitor said, I'll wait until you sign it. People got so mad about that. They were leaving the church. Unfortunately, that's kind of standard procedure, to have the dollar amount nailed down and say, give me this, here's a pledge card, sign it. That kind of removes the relationship with God, that removes the prayer and discernment, removes my own wisdom and discernment. It's kind of offensive. I would prefer people not leave the church over a capital campaign. So this can be done right. It's just super easy to be done wrong. Okay, so in one-on-one asks with major donors, remember, they're not a stranger. They're not aliens. They're not us versus them. They're not foreigners that are somehow uncomfortable with the circumstances. We're in the same community. We are members of the same fabric. And your work in this process has helped build a relationship between the church and that person. So as you go, ask their opinions on the campaign. Ask for the input. Ask them, would you be interested in sponsoring the education wing? Your brochure is going to have a list of all the things that have costs associated with them, so they can have the general approximation of the impact of my giving. Would you be interested in doing something like sponsoring the education wing of the campaign? It's a very gentle way to put the context around giving. It would be okay to say, would you consider being one of our leadership donors? It is a standard procedure for us to create a team of the top 10 donors and more. We also want opinion leaders. I read a book by Malcolm Gladwell. I learned the term mavens, in which he talks about there are always opinion leaders. So get them involved in your decision-making process. They know everybody. They're extroverts. Involve them. We want to put leadership donors and mavens on a leadership team. We always ask our leadership team, would you please be a leadership donor, and would you give early? And universally, the answer is yes. All right, so let me pause and open the floor for some questions. Meredith's identified a handful. Fire away, Meredith.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dennis, for going through these principles of making the ask with major donors. I think it can be really intimidating, and you've laid out a good process of building the relationship, so it's not so scary. A question from Mary Jane and Karen related to the COVID crisis and where we are with campaign phases now. Mary Jane said that they were beginning a discernment phase, and then all of that was put on hold when the state shut down. And then Karen also asked about, excuse me, how do you feel about doing a virtual lunch or a coffee with a pastor, since in a lot of places we're still social distancing? So those are coronavirus related questions. Maybe you could just address that, those issues briefly.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for asking those questions. Social isolation has really thrown a wrench into a lot of things. However, on Friday, I was on a webinar with 2,000 donors. 2,000. Now, my part of that was only a couple of minutes, and I did the ask. And I followed all of these principles. It was very general, and it was about discernment. And I just told my own story, why I care and why I'm giving. It was a very gentle ask. So should you do virtual events? Absolutely, 100%. As a matter of fact, please do them regularly. My pastor at my church does one every Wednesday, and he's a delightful chap. And it's kind of very interesting in the science of email opening and video length. You know, people will open an email if it has a video attached at a much higher rate than if it does not. Video length has changed since the arrival of the COVID crisis. 59 seconds meant if you do a video under 59 seconds, people will watch. Most people will watch it. The next threshold is 3 minutes. All of a sudden, those thresholds are gone. The average fireside chat by my pastor is 7 minutes. Now, you have a lot of latitude right now because of social isolation. People are much more tolerant. They're less busy. They're much more interested in connecting because we're starved for interpersonal connections. So, long answer to your question, please do virtual events. Please do virtual committee meetings. Please do virtual dialogues. Zoom and Google have wonderful products, and Skype. So there are 3 really good platforms out there to make the social interaction very easy. The only thing that I would advise is in each one of these, have a facilitator that is not the pastor, okay? Someone who's the organizer, who can manage it technologically, and who will be super direct and saying, okay, pastor, could you please talk about this? And then the facilitator would say, okay, pastor, now let me open the floor for questions and dialogue, or I'd like another person to speak. So it is not, the weight is not on the pastor to run the meeting, but the pastor is that spiritual resource serving in that role. And the facilitator is the servant of the meeting. Boy, do things work just a lot better. In my life, in my church, we have the wonderful mega super facilitator, Megan Berdalski, who's such a professional. Just every one of these presentations comes across smooth as silk, and everybody feels good about it. So have a pro, get them some training. In my opinion, I think you ought to do one once a week. So, thank you for asking. Okay, I'm open for more questions, but let me touch just briefly on thanking and follow through, and then we're going to wrap it up in the next couple of minutes. Thanking is a very important, and it does not have to be expensive or time consuming. I would beg and plead, please have your pastor call the top 100 after a campaign and thank them. And furthermore, please ask your pastor to write a personal note. I had a really good experience. I remember St. Elizabeth's hired a stewardship professional. One of the first things she did was have the pastor write 7 thank you notes per day. And it really stuck with me because she told me 3 months later that giving was up by 7%. 7 notes, 7%. So it was kind of easy for me to remember. I mean, what she would do every day is just bring in little note cards with a sticky on them, and they were already addressed with a stamp. And she would stand there while the pastor took a blue pen and wrote the thank you note. They just had to look at, what was on the sticky note. Tell me what to say. Sign it, just 2 sentences. And people were stunned. They wrote thank you notes back about being thanked, and giving went up. Now, from a macroeconomic viewpoint, I mean, we can see why. If somebody's only giving 1 to 2% of their income, they have a lot of room to grow. If they're there every week, it's part of their social structure. It's a natural thing. All right, let me pause. Meredith, I think, has another question. Fire away, Meredith.
Great, thank you. I think this question from Linda fits well with talking about the follow-through process and just the timeline of capital campaigns. She's wondering, when does Commitment Sunday happen in the process? That in some campaign structures, there's this idea of a quiet phase of a capital campaign and then Commitment Sunday coming in the public phase. So if you could just address that in relationship to maybe cultivating these relationships with major donors and get some clarity on that for Linda.
Linda, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. Yes, there is a silent phase, and this is it. These major donors compose those who give in the silent phase. So if this was the secular world, if this was outside of the church world, we would not announce that we have a commitment Sunday until the silent phase was completed and we have raised at least 50% of our goal. So our silent phase will tell us the amount that we can raise. So secular, a little bit different from church. In the church world, we set a date, and we set it out 6 months in advance. And we have 2 tracks. We have our silent phase, which with our top donors, and then we have everybody in the whole parish. So these 2 tracks are moving ahead. There's just a different number of people in each track. Their experiences are very similar. The only difference is in the major donor track, there are fewer number of people involved. On the whole parish track, it is everybody is invited to everything. So everybody has similar experiences. It's just a question of numbers. It's really important in a church world that we set the commitment Sunday, and we very clearly tell our major donors that we have a deadline 1 month before commitment Sunday, in which we would like to announce our major gifts portion of our campaign has been a success. So we tell our major donors, would you please be part of our early silent phase so that we can announce to everybody in the parish that we're already on our way to being a success. We've already got X amount committed. We're 1 month before commitment Sunday, and we're already looking like we're going to be a success. So Linda, your question is really the way I interpret it. How do we manage the momentum of a campaign? That is a very good question, and it is very important, which really points to the necessity of being professional in your approach to your capital campaign. It is not random. It is not based on luck. It is not accidental. Success in a capital campaign is a result of a highly professionally conducted set of activities. And I only say that because once you've done 100 of these things, you really begin to see these factors are as solid as planting and fertilizing and watering is to a farmer. It's a system and it works. And if you skip it, your yield will decrease dramatically. So thank you, Linda. That's a great question. So I'm open to other questions too. We're going to wrap up in about 1 minute. Within thanking and follow through, we want to kind of go overboard on thanking people. It doesn't cost hardly anything. Some people don't want to be thanked, but that's a very tiny minority of your church. Most people are very happy to be thanked. And we even think giving a gift is a good idea. And it's a really good idea that you have a donor sponsor the gift. So none of the money for the gift comes out of the coffers of the church. I got this lovely gift. I gave to a donation to a monastery, and they sent me back a CD of music singing by the nuns. It's delightful. It didn't cost hardly anything to produce, but it's one more connection I have to that convent full of nuns. So thank them personally, thank them frequently, give a gift, make sure the money doesn't come out of the coffers of the church. There needs to be a system too for everybody, a personalized letter from the pastor. And at the lower levels, it's okay if the personalized note comes from volunteers. Now, the last point I want to make before we wrap up, 1 year after your commitment Sunday of your capital campaign, start with your major gifts and start asking everyone for an estate gift. So we want everybody to remember the church and their estate plans. Now, we usually raise as much in this second wave of asking as we did in the capital campaign. Isn't that fascinating? Now, you don't get the money right then, but you get the commitments. The money comes later on. I remember working with a church in Colorado where somebody brought up that objection. Well, we're going to start the estate giving, but the money doesn't come right now. So I'm skeptical. And the pastor leaned in and said, well, we could arrange an acceleration of gifts. And I thought she was making a joke. I thought she was pretty funny. But anyway, this is a behavioral economics concept that is based on, I'm going to invest in the capital campaign, and then I will do an estate gift to ensure my first investment is valid and secure. Isn't that interesting? Back in 1966, a fellow named Cy Seymour wrote a landmark book on fundraising. the basic thesis of the entire book is the decision to give is an intuitive one, supported by rationalizations. And interesting. So we all know intuitively that we ought to support our church, and our church ought to be in our estate plans. But now I've got a rationalization. I'm going to invest now to make sure that original campaign pledge was well invested and secure. Now we get tremendous success. And you know, beyond this, the church development exists just to help churches flourish. And this is what we offer. These are the services that we offer. This is how we run a capital campaign. If you want me to come with you to visit your top donors, to be your consultant, to hold your hand and walk you through that, I would happily do that. I know that makes you think this guy is nuts, but it is a pleasure for me to do it, and I spend a lot of my time doing it. I've been studying it academically since the early 80s, and I have a great deal of comfort, and I've written a book about it. So call me if you would like some help, either planning your capital campaign or in managing your major donor gifts process. It would be a pleasure. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to give a plug for our next webinar. If you want to go to the next slide or two down. We had a question about verbalizing that ask for planned giving within the year, and I think we should build that into our conversation on June 17th will be our next webinar. It'll be specifically talking about planned giving efforts, the significance of that to your church's overall financial health, health type of non-cash gifts, that what the heck is a bequest, starting with some of the foundational questions a lot of our folks are wondering about, and then getting into the details about that. So I hope all of you can join us for that. Thank you, Dennis, so much for a great presentation on a complicated and nuanced topic, and sharing from a stewardship perspective. I think we all appreciate that.
My pleasure. Thank you all so much for joining us. Go forward. Good luck and God bless. Bye-bye.